Hi, Malu. Hi, Jordan.
Hello.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, I'm very happy to have you both on, especially because we're going to talk about an incredible book you've put together called Sumud, a new Palestinian reader. That's the book. We've got it in stereo. The book came out, if I'm not wrong, at the end of January at Seven Stories Press.
Yes.
It's an anthology that celebrates, the power of culture in Palestinian resistance. It's really thorough. It's a selections of memoir, of short stories, of essays, of poetry, and also of art. Very beautiful. There's, I think, 25 black and white illustrations by Palestinian
Yes.
artists in the book. You are both the editors of this book. I'm wondering, when did you decide to actually work on this book? Was this related to the genocide in Gaza, or it was something planned long before that? And I don't know who want to start.
We were talking, I was at the London Book Fair in 2023, and I met Dan Simon there. And I said, Marquez, we're thinking about doing an anthology. And then once the war started on Gaza, October 8th, it was so disturbing what was going on that I kind of felt that we needed to do something on Palestine. And the Marquez, we're in our fifth year. Jordan's the editor-in-chief of the Marquez Review, and we're in our fifth year. And even before I came to the Marquez as its literary editor, Jordan was publishing a wealth of very good essays, writings, memoirs, poetry from and about Palestine. And so we had this wealth of material to draw from.
Yeah, I would definitely say that if the war on Gaza hadn't happened when it did, that this book might have come out a little bit later, but it gave it a sense of urgency for sure.
And I mean, because it's such a thorough book again, and I think there's about 46 contributions. This is massive. In a way, it's massive, but there's loads of writing around it about, right? So how did you go about selecting the stories? How did you do that?
A lot of the
The
material
first thing,
came from the Marquez Review, as Malu said, but Malu's contribution to the book was really major because she focused much more on. So she gathered all the art with Nadine Aranki and also added more poetry to the book that we hadn't published online. So I don't know, maybe 80-90% of the book is in the Marquez Review, but some of it is either published elsewhere or original to this book.
but the selection process for the writing, it really was focusing it down on first person accounts. That's what we really wanted from the West Bank and from Gaza. But also, we wanted work or essays that really explored the idea of culture and resistance. So it's very different from a political history of Palestine or a political history of the Nakba. It's really looking at this idea of Sumud, steadfastness, standing fast as a form of resistance, and also as a way in to look at Palestinian culture. I mean, I know that you know that most of the books that are published about, there are thousands of books published about Palestine and Israel, and it's all about the political history or about political analysis or academic analysis. And really, we wanted to try to narrow and focus the book on voices from Palestine, voices of people who have lived in Palestine, who have supported Palestinians, but have also been active in education or the arts. Um, so we could really like look at resistance not in the way that it's usually talked about, and to move away from the stereotypes that plague Palestinian political movements and really get to the culture, which is something that has been cultural resistance has been a part of the resistance in Palestine since the Nakba.
Right. And
This is nothing new, but it's new to the world.
I think Sumud is really in the legacy of our dear Ghassan Kanafani, who of course was assassinated by the Mossad in 1972. But there's a literal renaissance of his work, and I think his spirit infuses the book because he embodied, he was a writer's writer, he was a painter, he was an activist, he was a militant without ever picking up a gun. And I would say that the same is true about everybody in this book. Everybody in here is militantly active for Palestine's freedom and justice, but without picking up weapons.
And I think that there are other shadows over the book. I would say that Edward Said is another, casts a long shadow over the book, and also Mahmoud Darwish. And a lot of the resistance or the cultural resistance or the writing that we have today, the writing has been influenced by these great thinkers. And this generation now, I feel, of Palestinian intellectuals and writers and poets, they're going into the next level of thinking about Palestine, and also how to think around the current situation, how they can push forward towards social justice, even when the obstacles get higher and more draconian.
I mean, you were saying, Malu, that cultural resistance has existed in Palestine since 48, and it's very easy to understand, right? Because as all colonial enterprises or settler colonial, when it comes to Israel, is the first thing a colonial enterprise does is try to erase the other. And how do you erase the other? You destroy its culture. You steal the books. You destroy the paintings. You destroy the poetry. So in a way, you destroy the oral history of a people to then be able to claim it's a land without a people for a people without a land. So there was this documentary called the Great Book Robbery, which explained that in 48, one of the first things Israel did is confiscate many books all over Palestine. So cultural resistance has been a key aspect of, I guess, Palestinian resistance.
It's interesting that you're talking about the confiscation of books. I'm sure you've been watching what happened in the educational bookshop in Jerusalem. The IDF had, they raided the shop. They've done it twice. The first time they raided, they took 300 titles. Some of it's children's book. The IDF soldiers who came in, the people who came in to confiscate books, to arrest people, they couldn't read Arabic. They were looking at the covers of the books using Google Translate. The second time they came, I think they confiscated 45 books. So it's interesting about these cycles of attacks on cultural production. Like that happened in 48. This is happening in 2025.
But
The tactics are the same in a way,
here's the thing, though. The first thing that the early Israelis did was destroy 540 Arab towns and villages. The second thing they did was to steal books and archives and the like. But they kind of failed along the way to understand how cultural legacy, how it resists destruction. And I say that thinking about what's going on right now in the United States with the arrest of Mahmoud Khalil and other Columbia students and other oppressive measures by the Trump regime. They're calling it, they're calling these people anti-Semitic, but they're attacking them, of course, for their political ideas. So while you can attack people and even jail them, put them in prison for political reasons, not criminal, because there's no criminal charges, or immigration, Sumud and the Marcos Review and arts, culture is sort of beyond the purview. Like Trump cannot arrest performers at the Kennedy Center. He can't put in jail. At least he's not at the stage yet where he can arrest the poets and the writers. But if you issue some political language and say, well, stop the genocide in Gaza, that's considered political, right? But, and of course, in our book, there are writers who are criticizing the genocide in various ways. But you see, it's like the Israelis are doomed to fail because they will never be able to erase the Palestinian voices.
Another thing that's sort of interesting, I think, about the book too, is that the book was definitely put together at this particular time. So Lena Monzer, who's a senior editor of the Marquez Review, watching the genocide when she was living in Beirut, she wrote an essay that it's called Palestine and the Unspeakable. And she was talking about the terms that you weren't really allowed to use when this essay was published, I think on the 23rd of October. And it's interesting how, you know, the word genocide, the phrase settler colonial state, apartheid, these were all words that if you used it in October 2023, you were really criticized for. And now people are being arrested because they've been using some of those words in 2025. So the book captures a moment of time, but this moment of time is still in development. We're still watching it being played out. And, you know, after this so-called first ceasefire, you know, Gaza is now being attacked right now as we speak in a horrible, brutal way by the Israelis. So it's almost like with Palestine, as we said before, about this the cycle of violence that continues, is that these things keep continuing, and I think it's important to call it out, to not just accept it as, oh, this is what's happening at this time and it's that fault. No, this is a long history of it. We should acknowledge that history so that people
The
can really
only,
understand.
the only problem with using that phrase cycle of violence is that it's used by sometimes hawks in the U.S. administration. So they use that as a way of saying that violence in the Middle East is intractable and will always be there. And what that does is it prevents us from really looking at the Israeli occupation of Palestine as an occupation, as apartheid, as genocide, which it's been from day one. Instead, we look at, oh, it's a cycle of violence. The Jews attack the Arabs attack the Jews. You know, it's just tit for tat. It's not really about that. In fact, it isn't even really correct to call it a conflict, as the comedian Mo Ammer pointed out in his recent series, the second season of the series. He's saying, no, I mean, Israel European Jews came in, there was this immigration. He recounts, so you get a sense of the history and the injustice of it. They took over, they expelled all these people. They continue to acquire more land. They continue to expel more people, in Sheikh Jarrah and in the West Bank, and now they're bombing the hell out of Gaza. So just to call it a conflict, it kind of implies like there's two sides and they're bickering over something, but it's actually the colonial settler that it's putting this, emprise on everyone else.
What's sort of interesting is like when we were doing the book is that we were talking about, you know, people would say Israel Palestine. And there was usually in the past when you'd use that phrase, there would be a hyphen between Israel, the word Israel, and the word Palestine. And so there was a real discussion that's gone on now about how that hyphen suggests that this is a war of equal sides. And so now the hyphen is out. That's something that people don't use anymore. And it's the forward dash. And the forward
Slash,
dash. And the
yeah,
forward dash suggests that
forward
it's
slash.
not equal, forward slash, excuse me, and it's not equal, and that, you know, that there's a different kind of relationship than what the hyphen suggested. So for me, who's been writing about Palestine for quite a long time, since the 1990s, it was very interesting for me to work with a really young editor at Seven Stories. His name was Tal Mancini. And that kind of detailed look at the language was it was remarkable. And also one thing I'm sure that you've noticed that we use the word Sumud. That's an Arabic word on the cover. We don't translate it on the cover. And that was also something that Jordan and Seven Stories and we really talked about. That, you know, that in America now people know what the word Sumud means. So we've come a long distance from when I was writing about the politics of Palestine in the 1990s and nobody gave a damn, to the hyphen. We're getting rid of the hyphen. So there has been, even though things seem to be getting worse, they are getting worse. The violence is getting
They're getting
more.
worse and they're getting better at the same time, aren't they?
Well, yes, that there's a generation coming up that is knowing.
But do you believe, because we are at a moment where it's very hard to have any kind of optimism. But you just said things are getting worse, but they're getting better. And I think as a movement, as activists, we have no choice but to believe that our struggle, our movement, is going to help make things better. Otherwise, you just crumble, and it's easy to crumble when you're facing when you're watching images of destroyed houses, dead, massacred children, women and men. But so where do you see things getting better, Jordan? Where do you have this kind of optimism?
Well, I was an activist in the streets against South Africa's apartheid regime in the 1980s, and it took 10 years from that time before it fell. And the South African army, the South African military, was one of the strongest, if not the strongest, of the African continent, just as Israel's military is the strongest in the region. But it eventually it failed because the world economic boycott against, finally, even the American supporters, American political and corporate supporters of the South African government had to cave into the economic boycott and say, this is no longer tenable. You're going to have to, change this whole government. And they realized, well, we got to let Mandela out of prison, and we have to talk to him, and we have to figure this out. Well, the Israelis haven't gotten to that point yet, but that's where they're going to have to go. The problem, though, however, is that they often will imprison or kill anyone that becomes a viable option as a Palestinian leader. Which it kills me, because the pro-Israeli people that I sometimes get into discussions with say, oh, the problem with the Palestinians is they never had a Gandhi, they never had a Mandela. That's the problem with them. They don't have any leadership. And then I would say, well, what about these people who are in prison, sometimes under administrative detention, which means no habeas corpus, basically no legal rights. It's kind of a Kafkaesque system where they're getting lost in this system, and they're being they're losing their viability as leaders, and that's what Israel wants. But I think that also is going to fail. A lot of the things that Israel tries, it seems to work for a while. Like their drone technology, they have very good overview of surveillance of Palestinians in the occupied territories. I don't know if that's a long-term strategy that's going to work for them. I don't know how long you can control a population that has a just cause.
And also, it makes you wonder about the vision that the Israelis have for their own people, that they really just want to be a huge penitentiary, that they want to sacrifice their young. It seems so odd to me that that they're really they've become like this militaristic society so that they can fight with all their neighbors, so that they can claim land for so-called security and never feel secure. It's an odd kind of ethno nationalism. It doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't suggest progress.
We can see that from the outside, but they're on the inside, and the way they see it, they have the constant victim mentality, which is Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas. Everybody wants to attack us. Everyone wants to kill us, and all the right-wing leaders use that kind of rhetoric to keep people all stirred up.
Yeah, and it's as you were saying, Malu, I think like any if you sort of put society and a human being next to one another, it's very hard to live your life only with based on hatred and ultra violence, right? An individual couldn't do that. He'll collapse eventually. And I think a society that has been based on ethno supremacy and ultra violence and occupation and apartheid at one point is going to crumble, and that's why also a lot of people are saying that when you liberate the colonized, you also in a way liberate the colonizer. But I wanted to ask you something about Sumud, because it's obviously the title of your book. Sumud is often translated in English as resilience. But for Palestinians, I think it means a lot more than resilience. don't you think? And also, I have an issue with resilience, because it's saying, yes, they've been oppressed, yes, they've been massacred for like 75 years, but they're so resilient. So, like saying it's resilient puts not the blame on them, but puts like they're okay because they're resilient, when we should be targeting, they shouldn't have to be resilient. You know what I mean? They should have freedom and equality like anyone else. So how did you go about not defining Sumud, but what do you think about what Sumud means when it comes to Palestine?
I think that I really took my direction from people like Raja Shahada, who's a writer, a human rights lawyer. He started Al-Haq, and we opened the introduction by quoting him. He said that Sumud is practiced by every man, woman, and child here in Palestine, struggling on his or her own to learn to cope with and resist the pressures of living as a member of an occupied people. Sumud is watching your home turned into a prison. You choose to stay in that prison because it is your home and because you fear that if you leave, your jailer will not allow you to return. It is developing from an all-encompassing form of life into a form of resistance that unites the Palestinians living under the Israeli occupation. That's one of the definitions that we start with in Sumud. And then I turn to the poet Hala Alyan, who's a much younger Palestinian generation. She's a clinical psychologist. Her family's from Gaza. And she had written an op-ed piece for The Guardian in which she was, her opinion piece, which ran in 2024, last year, was entitled, "I Am Not There, I Am Not Here, a Palestinian American poet bearing witness to atrocity." She's making a reference to Tabak, a poem called Counterpoint. It was an elegy for the late Edward Said written by Mahmoud Darwish. And in her essay, Alyan explores an essential aspect of contemporary Palestinian life. And to quote her, "The idea of Sumud has become multifaceted cultural concept among Palestinians." Along with this idea that it means steadfastness, she adds the word in Arabic, she says, is quote, a derivative of arranging or saving up or even adorning. It implies composure braided with rootedness, a posture that might bend but will not break. So really what it is not becoming like that we're not saying that the Palestinians are resilient. We're not using it to describe them. They themselves are describing themselves as a people who will not break. Their posture might bend, but they will not break. And I think that it gives a more clear indication of what Sumud is. It's not something that they've fallen into and that we should give them, somehow they get our pity because they're resilient. No, they are in for the long game, and they know the difficulties that lie ahead, and yet they are committed. And I think that's what makes them, at this time, these are the people that we're looking at now. As things really get dire, we are going to need that kind of inspiration in all of our lives.
Yeah, I think instead of thinking of it as resilience, we should think of it as resourcefulness.
There you go.
The Palestinians are being as resourceful as anyone can in the face of all of the oppression.
And they've had, decades of being resourceful.
Yeah, thank you both. I think it's to be completely transparent. I haven't had time to read the whole book. I received the PDF version about a week ago, but I've read quite a few contributions, and again, I think they are really I hate using the word like rehumanizing the Palestinians, but we know how dehumanized they've been, and even more so since October 7th. But it helps to see these beautiful people. I mean, I don't know if you've been to Palestine, but I've been many times over the years. I mean, I haven't been for 10 years. I was denied entry in 2013. But I discovered, and I don't want to feel like, it's not about obviously Orientalism or anything, but you meet a people that is beautiful in so many ways, and that resist through culture, through humor, through so many ways. And I think the book really shows that. And we live in a moment, I think, of hopefully extreme clarity about power, about imperialism, colonialism. And I think where I get my optimism is the hundreds of thousands of people in the streets, the millions in the streets, the people blocking boats, the people blocking Congress, the demonstration daily, even where I live here in Brussels. It's got to give us hope in the midst of complete horror, because there's no other words, So I wanted to thank you both again. I mean, if you want to add anything, Jordan or Malu, now is the time. But otherwise, yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Jordan always says to audiences at the book launch, buy a copy of the book if you want for yourself, but buy a copy for your library. Give it to your library. And I think that the voices in Sumud, they can argue for themselves. They can be interrogated and they'll stand up. And I think it's important that the platform is wide so that many people can meet them. Thank you.
Well done.
Thanks both.
Thanks again.
Thanks.
Au revoir.
Bye-bye.